So today's topic is looking at the geopolitics of the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN, and what ASEAN means for the Indo-Pacific, both from the perspective of countries like Japan, but also for the ASEAN countries themselves. And this is a little bit different, and that's why I wanted to separate those two arguments. So let's think about ASEAN, and think about ASEAN in terms of its history and in terms of its identity. ASEAN has worked together in its current 10-country format for about 30 or 40 years, and one of the key pillars of its cooperation is something called consensus-based decision-making, or the so-called ASEAN way. And what that means is that everybody agrees on something, and that's how it gets done, through consultation, through diplomacy, and through understanding or thinking about each other's position and finding some kind of common ground. So we often talk about this in terms of low politics, and that ASEAN can achieve a lot of things in the low political area. And one of the most, I guess, best examples of that is migration between ASEAN countries. So if you're a Vietnamese, you can go to Singapore, you can go to the Philippines, you can go to Myanmar without a visa. And that's a pretty good example of the kind of cooperation that goes on through ASEAN. So that would be considered low politics. But on high politics, or the more difficult issues, such as a code of conduct in the South China Sea, or let's say a common taxation policy, or a common position on China, here ASEAN doesn't perform very well in terms of the area of high politics. Even on something like AUKUS, and I see Hiroaki is online, and he's interested in limiting the roles of intermediate missile systems and other kinds of missile systems in the region. It's very difficult for ASEAN to have a common platform on something like the AUKUS and nuclear-powered submarines operating in and around the South China Seas. And we've seen countries like the Philippines and Vietnam welcome the agreement, where other countries are very hesitant, and they discuss it in terms of nuclearizing a region that was previously not nuclearized. So the key things to understand about ASEAN is it focuses on consensus-based decision-making and the so-called ASEAN way. And this has been the platform for regional integration for the past 40 or 50 years, where countries agree that they wouldn't really move forward on any significant policy until all the countries come to consensus. Now, this has resulted in what we call a Indo-Pacific strategy, or outlook in the case of ASEAN, that re-emphasizes the role of ASEAN centrality in Asia's regional integration. What that means is that all countries agree to the process, or that any kind of change of the status quo in the region would have to come through consensus of all the stakeholders in mind. And what that means is that everybody has the same agreement and the same understanding of whatever particular issue it is. So that could be how to understand the South China Sea territorial issues, or it could be about the movement of people in ASEAN throughout the region, maybe visa-free, or a particular position on something like the environment. So the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook really puts ASEAN front and center in terms of the Indo-Pacific's development, and it puts the ASEAN way, consensus-based decision-making, as the key framing of how countries within the Indo-Pacific region that want to work with ASEAN should be engaged in region building. Now, this means that Japan really ASEAN works with other countries to promote this kind of decision-making process, this consensus-based decision-making process, and it really tries to ensure that ASEAN remains the central connector or hub between the so-called Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean part of the Pacific. And there's a lot of stakeholder buy-in here, in that many countries in ASEAN don't want to choose between China and the United States. They want to maintain the consensus-based decision-making, because it ensures that there's no dramatic change in the region on things like governance or human rights or security, which suits the heterogeneity of the ASEAN countries, in that amongst the ASEAN countries, there's many kinds of political systems, there's many kinds of economic systems, and there's many levels of development. And the best example, of course, is comparing Singapore versus the Philippines. One is a soft authoritarian regime, and the other is a flawed democracy that is definitely an emerging state. Now, these two comparisons are really interesting because they work together on some issues, and other issues they don't. So that is the ASEAN side of the Indo-Pacific when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific. But when we think about Japan and how Japan is thinking about ASEAN in its own Indo-Pacific vision, it's important to understand that Japan's position continues to evolve. And what does that mean? If we were to go back to Prime Minister Abe's initial framing of the Indo-Pacific region, it looked at ASEAN as an important partner of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, but not the key partner. And when we look at Japan's diplomatic blue books, whether from 2017 or 18 or 19, ASEAN isn't really centrally positioned in the diplomatic blue books, although it is recognized as an important part of the Indo-Pacific region. But in the blue book of 2020 and 2021, of course, we see that the Japanese government has placed has done a tremendous job of placing ASEAN front and center of how Japan is thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. And with that, they're really focusing on the idea of ASEAN being a critical part of the Indo-Pacific, and that the ASEAN way or ASEAN centrality remains a critical part of how Japan is understanding the Indo-Pacific region. Now, when we're thinking about this further, how is Japan trying to strengthen ASEAN's position in the Indo-Pacific? Here, and we've talked about this in previous discussions, it's doing this through various kinds of activities. And one of the biggest activities is to provide a significant amount of aid to Southeast Asia. And that aid is what we call overseas direct development assistance. So helping ASEAN develop their economies and develop their societies in a way that is in line with Japanese interests, but is also synergistic with Japan's economic priorities. And that means focusing on the diversification of supply chains, focusing on the diversification of trade partners, but also helping strengthen the strategic autonomy of ASEAN by boosting the intra-ASEAN economic integration. And from Japan's perspective, the view is that the more integrated ASEAN is, the more it can function autonomously or strategically autonomously in terms of foreign policy. And that's a real critical feature of Japan's foreign policy, is to strengthen ASEAN. So in terms of Japan's view about the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN could be a much stronger and more reliable partner that can make decisions that are independent of China. And I think this is something that we underestimate in terms of thinking about ASEAN's role within the region, is that it has its biggest trading partner is China, and it needs to think about that relationship and prioritize that relationship when it's engaging in different kinds of relations. But at the same time, it wants to have that strategic independence so that it can make decisions that are better for ASEAN. So Japan's position on ASEAN is to continue trying to strengthen it internally so that its institutions are more cohesive, so it can make decisions more strategically autonomous, and that it is wedded to the shared view about the importance of a rules-based approach to international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. And that means creating new rules that are important for emerging issues within the region. And that could be things like the digital economy. It could be things like AI. It could be things like transnational disease policy. So when Japan is advocating for a rules-based region, it's not advocating for keeping the rules as they are, but adopting rules that are transparent and really focused on a transparent, rules-based approach to international relations. And that's really important. And it views ASEAN as an important part of that because ASEAN is one of the hubs for Japan's manufacturing network. But it also sees the ASEAN way as a useful tool to prevent one country from dominating the region. And the ASEAN way, again, going back to this point about consensus-based decision-making, that any decision that would go on in the region couldn't be dominated by one country. It would have to come through a consensus of all the countries within the region. And by supporting this kind of initiative, really it prevents, or Japan's trying to prevent what we call a might is right approach to how the Indo-Pacific region is governed. And there's another expression for this, is that the powerful countries do what they want and weak countries do what they must to survive in this kind of system. And Japan doesn't want to be part of that system. It doesn't want ASEAN to be part of the system. They want to make sure that rules are the final arbiter of how states behave within the region. Now, Japan is working with ASEAN countries in other ways as well. We've talked about strategic partnerships before, but you've seen Prime Minister Abe visit Vietnam this week. And in that visit, he's talked about trade. He's talked about building human capacity in the Vietnamese context. He's talked about interoperability training between the two states. And he's also talked about building Vietnam's own capacities to deal with some of its maritime security challenges in the South China Sea. So how is Japan helping? Well, providing Coast Guard vessels, providing some technologies to bolster Vietnam's own maritime awareness capabilities, ships committed to visiting Cam Ranh Bay, one of the big deep water ports in Vietnam, regularly, to build a shared understanding of the region. And that's really, really important. And I see that Lynn and Stephen and Irwin and Badr and others are online that may be able to share their views on this. But Japan really wants to create strong partners in Southeast Asia so that they will look to Japan for support, for some leadership, and for cooperation on development that will help them deal with the challenges within the region. Now, other countries are also looking at ASEAN in very critical ways. United States is looking to ASEAN to be an important part of where it invests and starts to build institutions. We see the European Union also look to ASEAN as an important area where they want to help strengthen through infrastructure and connectivity, to helping them build with resilience within the region. And we also see other countries like my own, Canada, interested in development and something called inclusive development and dealing with climate change within ASEAN as well. And what this speaks to is that many countries understand that if they want to get stakeholder buy-in into their Indo-Pacific strategies or visions and guidelines, that it's going to be really, really critical for them to actually provide the public goods that ASEAN wants. And while ASEAN has security concerns with China, their primary concern continues to be development. In the COVID-19 pandemic era, another priority, of course, is recovering from the pandemic, to opening up their economies to tourism. And you've seen probably in the news countries like Thailand with their economy, I think it's 12 or 15 or even up to 17% of their GDP is based on tourism. So they want to open up, and they're looking for partners to help them open up their economies so that they can reap the benefits of integration and being part of a free and open world. And this is really, really important. And if countries are primarily advocating security, a hardline approach to the biggest challenge in the region, China, it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to get stakeholder buy-in. And what I mean by that is that ASEAN will just say, listen, we appreciate the ideas, we appreciate the thoughts, but ultimately we can't choose between our economic partner of China and our more comprehensive partner, whether that's Japan or the United States or others. And as a result, we're going to stick with the status quo. So we see ASEAN advocating for an Indo-Pacific vision or strategy or outlook that's focusing on development, ASEAN centrality, and we see Japan and other countries finding ways to get stakeholder buy-in by ASEAN through focusing on development, infrastructure, connectivity, human capacity building, and others. And I think that's some really, really important way for us to be thinking about how ASEAN and Japan and other countries are looking at the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a great opportunity now to have others jump in here and share their views about the importance of the Indo-Pacific and how ASEAN and other countries are looking at the region.